Today we're going to talk about three groups of animals in the animal kingdom. The first of these is the reptiles. Then we'll talk about birds, and lastly we'll finish up the animal kingdom talking about mammals. The next 2 weeks we'll be talking about the plant kingdom, and then we'll probably have 1 or 2 weeks on evolution, and then at that point we will be switching over to human biology, just to give you an update on how things are going to go. Reptiles have several characteristics that separate them from other animals. The first of these is they are generally covered with tough, dry scales. Now, these are not the same sort of scales that you see on fish, but they are adapted for land and habitation as opposed to being in the water. The second is that they are ectothermic. You will recall that ectothermic is another term for this, by the way, is poikilothermic. This means that they assume the temperature of their surroundings, and so they're incapable of maintaining their body temperature, and whatever the temperature of their surroundings is what they end up being. And what tends to occur is that when it's warm and sunny, they are able to get around and do things pretty well, but when it gets cold, they have to slow down, and many times they have to either hibernate or go into a semi-dormant state. So that's why when it's cold outside, you don't, for example, have to worry about snakes or lizards or other sorts of critters like that. Thirdly, they are the first group that we will encounter that breathe through their lungs throughout their life. You remember in the amphibians, we had lungs, but we also had gills and respiration through the skin. But the reptiles are the first group that do their entire work of breathing and oxygen exchange using lungs. They have a 3-chambered heart like an amphibian, but the ventricular chamber, their single ventricle, has a partial divide. This does not prevent blood from mixing and causing a mixed arterial venous type blood, but it does help separate the blood so that they have a better passage of blood to the systemic side versus the pulmonary side. And then lastly, most reptiles are oviparous. That is, they lay their eggs external to the body and then they are hatched. They don't lay them in water. They lay them on dry land, and we'll talk about how they do that in a minute. And then a few are ovoviviparous. That is, they have eggs that actually hatch within the body, and then the young are born alive outside of the body. As I said, they have a egg that is able to be laid outside water, and this sort of egg is called an amniotic egg. This egg has a shell, and retains water within the shell. This allows them to lay their eggs on land as opposed to in the water. And this is very important to an animal that spends essentially its entire life on land. The shell, which is shown here on the outside, is a hard outer covering that acts to protect the entire egg. The amnion is this coat right here just outside the embryo. So you have the amnion is right along here, and the amnion grows around the embryo and is then filled with fluid called an amniotic fluid, and this serves to cushion the embryo. Then you have a yolk sac, which is shown right here, and the yolk sac, you'll notice, is attached right here to what looks like an umbilicus, although it's not an umbilicus. And this yolk sac has nutrients and feeds the egg as it grows, feeds the embryo as it grows, excuse me. Then as we go along, there's also this other sac over here. So here was the yolk sac, and here's the amnion on the outside of the egg or embryo here with the amniotic fluid that cushions the embryo. The yolk sac feeds the embryo, and then we have this other structure called the allantois. And the allantois is a site for respiration, but also stores the waste products of the embryo as they produce waste products. And then all of this is all of the allantois, the yolk sac, all of this is covered by something called the chorion. And the chorion is a protective cushion, but also holds for gas exchange. Now outside the chorion, in this area out here, next to the shell, is the albumin. And this is also a cushion that prevents the shell from, or the embryo from being damaged. Now as we look at the different kinds of reptiles, the first of these is a group of reptiles called the Tuatara. And that Tuatara word means spine bearer, which you'll see in just a second. And many people think that this, and I'm not about to try to say this word, but that this group also included most of the dinosaurs. And I will not be talking about dinosaurs during this talk, although it is covered in your book. And I will not be asking questions about dinosaurs on the quiz. But this is the Tuatara, and you can see it has a very prominent spine along its back, which is part of the reason it has the name that it has. Then up here you'll see this little area right here, and this is what's known as the parietal eye. The parietal eye is a so-called third eye. It's on the forehead. It actually has a lens. It has light sensing organ like a retina, but it is unable to pass that information on to the brain. So although there's an eye here that looks like it might be functioning, it does not pass information to the brain. The second group, which is a much larger and more commonly encountered group, is called the squamata. And the squamata include lizards, which are here, and snakes, which are down here. So it's the lizards and the snakes, the class Squamata. The difference between lizards and snakes are as follows. First of all, lizards have 2 sets of legs. Snakes obviously don't have legs. Snakes are deaf and unable to hear, and they generally sense their environment by other ways. Lizards have ears, although they're not great in terms of their ability to hear. They do have ears and they are able to hear. By the way, you may wonder, if snake charmers, when they're charming the snakes, they're playing a flute or whatever, and the actual charming of the snake is with the motion of the flute. As they move the flute up and down, the snake is charmed by that motion as opposed to the actual sound which they cannot hear. This, by the way, if you read the story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, a Sherlock Holmes story called The Mystery of the Speckled Band, one of the problems with that story was the snake that was sent over to kill the individual was called back by a whistle. And because snakes are deaf, that's actually not possible. Snakes have special scales on their bellies that are used for locomotion. Lizards have the same sorts of scales all over their body and do not have special scales for locomotion. And then lastly, snakes cannot close their eyes because they do not have eyelids. Lizards, on the other hand, can close their eyes, and they do have an eyelid which they can close and protect their eyes with. So the reason that a snake is always seems to be looking at its prey or looking at you if you happen to be with a snake is because it does not have the ability to close its eyes. Now when we look specifically at lizards, just a few facts that would be nice to remember for future sake. First of all, the largest lizard in the world is the Komodo dragon. And you've seen these. They used to use Komodo dragons in old dinosaur movies. The Komodo dragons were one of the dinosaurs that they used to use for those old movies like The Adventures of the Lost World and things of this nature. They are the largest lizard, and they are dangerous. They do eat meat, and they will attack other animals and even humans if provoked. The chameleon, which is something that the name, you've heard this name chameleon, is something that can change its color or change its skin. And indeed, the chameleon is able to change its skin in order to fit into the background and to camouflage itself. The horned toad is an interesting lizard in that it's capable of squirting blood from its eye. And this is a defensive measure that it uses if an attacker is headed for it and it becomes provoked or afraid. It will squirt this out and try to stop the attacker from attacking. In the United States, the Gila monster is not the largest lizard, but it's distinguished by the fact that it is poisonous, and it can cause death in humans if they're bitten. Excuse me. Now we turn to snakes, and this snake is what is known as a constrictor. First of all, I'll mention that those specialized scales on the belly of the snake that are part of the snake's locomotion are called scutes. And I guess that's a kind of an appropriate name. These scales anchor to the ground when the snake is moving and allow it to move. Now there are actually 4 types of motion that a snake can undergo in order to move. There's something called the concertina motion, which it anchors the front part of its belly, pulls its tail up, then it anchors its tail and moves its front part out. That's called concertina. There's rectilinear motion, in which the scutes themselves basically grab the ground and slowly move the snake forward. There's a specialized motion called the sidewinding motion. And then there's this sort of countercurrent motion where the snake pushes up against the side of the path that it's on and causes it to move from left to right as it moves along. Snakes also have small sensory pits in their mouths, and if you were ever wondering why a snake is constantly flicking its tongue out, what it's actually doing is drawing the surrounding air into its mouth, because in its mouth are sensory areas known as the Jacobson organ, and this sensory area can analyze chemicals, and it's much like a sense of smell or an additional sense of smell. And the tongue is what brings this into the mouth. As I said, this snake that you're looking at here is known as a constrictor. A constrictor kills by squeezing its prey to death. And essentially what happens is the constrictor wraps itself around the body of the animal, and each time the animal breathes out, the constrictor squeezes and prevents it from being able to breathe in until it gets to the point that it cannot breathe in at all and it suffocates. And then the constrictor will eat the animal. More information about snakes. The non-constricting snakes can be divided into 2 groups, those that have a neurotoxin and those that have a hemotoxin. The neurotoxin is a poison that attacks the nervous system, and this is a cobra, and a cobra is one of those kinds of snakes that have neurotoxin. The cobra and snakes like cobras in the United States, the most common of these is the coral snake, have generally a small mouth with small fangs, and therefore they generally have to get a pretty good hold of you in order to get a bite. It's much more difficult for these snakes to bite than it is for the other type that we'll be talking about. The second group has a hemotoxin. The hemotoxin attacks blood and blood vessels, and this is much more common in the United States. And the most common snakes that carry hemotoxin are vipers. Vipers have long fangs and are poisonous with the hemotoxin, and vipers are what you're used to dealing with when you see snakes on television, rattlesnakes, etc. And here's somewhat a drawing of such a snake, and you notice they have very long injecting like fangs. The neurotoxin type snakes like the cobra, do not have great big long fangs like that. Now, some vipers have heat sensing organs that are right near the nostrils, And these are called pits. And you may have heard the term pit viper. And they can sense the heat of an animal near them in addition to seeing and smelling them. The last point I'll make about these snakes is that they have most more larger animals, the jawbone, the mandible, attaches directly to the skull. This is true for almost all mammals. But in snakes, the jawbone attaches to something called the quadrate bone. And the quadrate bone then attaches to the mandible, or to the skull. And this allows the snake to open its mouth very wide in order to swallow very large prey. And snakes have been shown to be able to swallow things that are 2 or 3 times as big as their head. Now, the last group of reptiles that I'll be talking about are the last 2 groups. This one is called the Testudines. These are the turtles and tortoises. Turtles live in the water. Tortoises live on land. And one interesting thing is that the giant sea turtle can reach weights of up to 1,500 pounds. Also, turtles can live to be exceedingly old, and there are turtles that have been shown to be over 100 years old. The other group are the Crocodilia. Crocodilia is the alligators and crocodiles. Alligators have a short, blunt snout, and when they shut their mouths, generally no teeth show. And this is an example of an alligator. A crocodile, on the other hand, is distinguished by the fact that generally when they shut their mouths, you can still see teeth. And here's an example of a crocodile. Now, their snout can also be more elongated or pointed than the alligator.